So this is a continuation of the urinary system, part B. We're picking up at tubular reabsorption. We previously spoke of glomerular filtration and the producing of the filtrate, which is, for all essential purposes, blood plasma without the proteins. It has all the same components. When it leaves the glomerular capsule, the renal capsule, and enters into the tubules of the nephron, we start with tubular reabsorption, which is putting everything back into the blood that we want to keep and eliminating it from the filtrate, with the ultimate goal of making urine. It's keeping the things that we want to keep. So tubular reabsorption really is selective. It keeps the things that we want to keep. And it has to cross a couple of epithelial barriers. The one epithelial barrier that it crosses is the renal tubules themselves, the nephron tubules. And the other is the walls of the peritubular capillaries. And through this, we bring back all the nutrients. We reabsorb all the nutrients, presumably, as much water as we can, and the reabsorption of ions. Hormones regulate how much water comes back and how many ions come back. This is an important concept. We've dealt with it a little bit in the endocrine system, but we'll revisit it now. So how does this stuff all get back? And remember, we make about 180 liters of filtrate and we pee about 1.5 liters of urine. So that means 178.5 liters get reabsorbed through this process. And there's two ways that it gets reabsorbed. It either squeezes between the epithelial cells or it goes through the epithelial cells. We call the squeezing past the epithelial cells, between them, the paracellular route, and we call the going right through the cells the transcellular route. So in the transcellular route, it's a little bit more complicated, but there are membranes. There's the cell membrane on the lumen side, which comes into contact with the filtrate. There's the cytoplasm and the cytosol of the cells of the walls of the tubule. There's the cellular membrane on the outside of the tube, the basolateral membrane, it's called. And then there's the endothelium of the peritubular capillaries. And this stuff all has to cross that. But the paracellular route, it goes between cells. Now, mostly this happens in the proximal convoluted tubule, where the tight junctions aren't really so tight. And the only thing that really goes the paracellular route are water and some of the ions that are, some of the cations that are dissolved in the water. These cations, it's important because they can't cross cell membranes. They're electrically charged, so they're polar. So this is an easy route for them to go. When we look at it, we can see that the paracellular route passes between two cells and ends up in the transcellular. Can happen a couple of ways. One is active transport or secondary active transport. The other is more of a passive transport. Now, sodium is really the driving force of this. When we talk about reabsorption in the kidneys, it really is about moving sodium. And sodium's easy to move because we have sodium-potassium pumps driven by ATP. It's primary active transport. over the couple of semesters that we've done this, how many times have we talked about sodium potassium pumps? It is the driving force. Now, what's interesting is that the sodium potassium pumps, in the case of the tubules, are actually on the basolateral side of the cells, and that there are openings for sodium on the luminal side. So sodium enters these cells via facilitated diffusion, and it leaves the cells via active transport, primary active transport. So it's slightly complex, but it'll make sense. It's easy to get the sodium into the peritubular capillaries because there's very low hydrostatic pressure in the peritubular capillaries, and there's a very high osmotic pressure in the peritubular capillaries. The peritubular capillaries have blood that still has all the proteins and all the formed elements, the red blood cells, white blood cells, platelets, and that, but it's very low on blood plasma because the blood plasma has been lost to the filtrate. So the osmotic pressure is really very high, much higher than most other blood. When we talked about bulk flow in capillaries in the cardiovascular system, we talked about it being an osmotic pressure of 25. It's probably, well, it's a lot higher than that in these peritubular capillaries. They're a special case. Now, this is really talking about secondary active transport. Again, I talked about this last semester when we talked about membrane transport and cells, but we will talk about it again. When sodium gets pumped, it creates a gradient because it's pumped against the gradient, so it creates an osmotic gradient. And then water follows the sodium. It's actually called sodium drag. Then anything that's absorbed in the water, if it can get through the cell membranes via some sort of a carrier or some sort of facilitated diffusion, they will follow because they will go with the water, and they're following the sodium. Secondary active transport is a lot like, well, the analogy that I use is if I owned a bar and I know that men between the ages of 19 and 25 are the biggest consumers of beer, and I want to sell beer, then I need to get those guys into the bar. By getting young women into the bar, the young men will follow. And to get the young women into the bar, I will have a good DJ because young women like to go dancing. So I get a good DJ, I primary transport young women into my bar, and then the young men will follow and presumably buy beer. That's secondary active transport. So moving the sodium by a sodium potassium pump really sets up these osmotic gradients and sets up the flow that allows the reabsorption of just about everything else. Now, the number of carriers or facilitators to the diffusion of the organic molecules really limits how much comes across. And we call the amount that can actually get across the transport maximum. And if the concentration of the substance in the filtrate exceeds the transport maximum, then not all of it will leave the filtrate. For instance, there's a transport maximum of glucose, and glucose gets reabsorbed by secondary active transport through carriers of glucose, because to get it across the cell membrane of the tubule epithelium. If blood glucose levels are too high, then the glucose levels in the filtrate will exceed the transport maximum, and not all of the glucose will leave the filtrate. It will end up in the urine. So in the case of somebody with diabetes, it makes sense that there would be sugars in the urine, because the transport maximum of the glucose in the tubules is reached, and there's only a certain amount that can be reabsorbed. The rest is just peed away. So water, as I said to you once before, if you're talking about moving water, it's probably by osmosis. But water has to get across somehow too, not just paracellular, but transcellular. And there are pores, there are channels for water called aquaporons. Great name, aquaporons, pores for water. Moving the water drags along things that are dissolved in the water, and fat soluble will just follow the osmotic gradient as well. We don't need carriers for fat soluble because they can get across the membrane. So really it ends up looking like this. This sodium-potassium pump here. So this on this side is the filtrate. Over here is the blood. There's interstitial fluid in between. This is a cell, an epithelial cell on the walls of the proximal convoluted tubule. Sodium gets in through facilitated diffusion into the lumen, or into the cytoplasm of the cell. There are sodium channels that are constantly open. The sodium-potassium pump moves sodium out of the cell, potassium in. That's why the sodium levels in the cytoplasm are low, because it's being pumped out, which sets up the gradient that allows the facilitated diffusion of sodium from the filtrate into the cytoplasm. So by pumping this out, this comes in and fills the gap. The water-soluble glucose, amino acids, vitamins, and things like that all follow their facilitated diffusion because of osmosis. Right? Water enters through aquaporons, and this is important, and it passes right through by aquaporons on the other side. The potassium that's returned via the sodium-potassium pump finds equilibrium through potassium channels. All of this, by using ATP to pump sodium, draws more sodium in, draws the facilitated diffusion of the water-soluble things through their channels, draws water through the aquaporons, and actually draws the lipid-soluble substances right through the cell membranes, because they can. It also sets up high osmotic gradients here, which allows the paracellular route to happen. So it all depends on this: the carriers, the channels, and the sodium-potassium pump. Okay, so where does all this happen? It happens along the entire renal tubules, but the proximal convoluted tubule is the biggie. 65% of the sodium and water, virtually all the nutrients, all the ions, and all the small proteins get reabsorbed at the proximal convoluted tubule. This is where the carriers and the transport molecules, the transport proteins for glucose and vitamins and all kinds of things, are found. They're not found in the rest of the tubules. So if it's not absorbed in the proximal convoluted tubule, it'll probably end up being excreted in the urine. Most of the sodium, most of the water happens here. In the loop of Henle, all we're really doing by this point is trying to bring back more water and more ions. Right? So the descending limb of the loop of Henle has got lots of aquaporins in it, and the medulla is very high osmotic gradients. It's very salty. And the reason it's very salty is because the ascending limb has sodium-potassium pumps, and so we literally pump more sodium out of the remaining 35% of the sodium that's left in the filtrate, which makes the medulla saltier, which then creates an osmotic gradient, which then makes more water leave. So in the descending limb, aquaporins, water. In the ascending limb, no aquaporins, no water, but sodium-potassium pumps that move primarily sodium and potassium, but then the anion chlorine moves because it chases the sodium. So in the distal convoluted tubule, this is where the hormones work. And this is really, really important. In the distal convoluted tubule is where we fine-tune the quality of the urine to match our body's needs and to help with homeostasis. So the distal convoluted tubule has got sodium-potassium pumps that turn on and off by a hormone. It's got calcium pumps that turn on and off by a hormone, and it's got aquaporins that can be opened or closed by hormones. So the hormone that turns on the calcium pump is parathyroid hormone. When calcium levels are low, blood calcium levels are low, the parathyroid gland releases parathyroid hormone. Parathyroid hormone has a couple of effects. One, it causes more absorption of calcium in the intestines. Two, it causes osteoclasts to eat bone and release calcium. And three, it turns on calcium pumps in the distal convoluted tubule and collecting ducts so that any calcium that's in the filtrate gets brought back to the bloodstream. If we want concentrated urine, we're dehydrating and we want to get as much water back, we open the aquaporins in the distal convoluted and collecting duct. And by opening the aquaporins, these are aquaporin 2s. The ones that are always open are called aquaporin 1s. And we reabsorb more water. And the hormone that does that comes from the pituitary gland, and it's antidiuretic hormone. In the presence of antidiuretic hormone, we reabsorb more water. We open the aquaporin 2s. In the absence of antidiuretic hormone, we don't open them, and there's more water in our urine. Alcohol, ethanol, beer, wine, booze, inhibits the release of antidiuretic hormone, and that's why you pee a lot when you're drinking, and that's why you're dehydrated the next morning and feeling hungover. It's because of the distal convoluted tubule and collecting duct aquaporin 2s not opening because of a lack of antidiuretic hormone. Now, the sodium levels have to be just right, and there's two hormones that do that. One is called aldosterone. Aldosterone is released by the adrenal gland, by the adrenal cortex, and it's the mineralocorticoid. What it does is it responds to either not enough sodium or too much potassium. there's not enough sodium, the sodium-potassium pumps in the distal convoluted tubule and collecting ducts open, and more sodium is pumped back into the body. If there's too much potassium in the body, then the sodium-potassium pumps, the same sodium-potassium pumps turn on, and potassium is secreted out of the body and into the filtrate, which is soon to be urine, and gotten rid of that way. So aldosterone increases sodium, decreases potassium. Atrial natriuretic peptide is a peptide made by the heart, and it's responding to blood pressure. The thing about sodium is that it causes osmosis, which brings more liquid to the blood, which increases blood pressure, which increases the venous return to the heart. The heart responds to the atrial swelling or stretching by releasing atrial natriuretic peptide, and atrial natriuretic peptide, which means protein from the heart that makes your pee salty, natriuretic, turns off any active sodium-potassium pumps in the collecting ducts and the distal convoluted tubule, and more sodium is lost to the pee, thus lowering blood pressure. So very important that hormones do this. And because next semester, when we talk about endocrine disorders, there are disorders of PTH, ADH, aldosterone, ANP. And this controls the homeostasis of blood pressure, of hydration, of calcium. So this has effects on bones. This has effects on a lot of different things. So aldosterone targets the principal cells in the ducts and the distal convoluted. You get more sodium and potassium channels on the luminal side, and you get more sodium-potassium pumps on the basolateral side. More sodium is brought back to the body, more potassium is lost. So tubular secretion is the exact opposite of tubular reabsorption. And really, we use it for excess potassium, excess acidity, getting rid of the ammonia and the nitrogenous waste, creatine, some organic acids, but really it's mostly potassium and hydrogen ions. It really is used to get rid of stuff that got reabsorbed but we don't really want to keep. So stuff that have been passively reabsorbed but we don't want to keep, so we get rid of it by pumping it out using the sodium-potassium pump. Bicarbonate and hydrogen ions go this way too. But potassium is the big deal. Now, our body is very finely tuned to avoid dehydration. When water is scarce, we make concentrated urine. When water is abundant, we make dilute urine. And it's regulated by regulating the osmolality of the urine and just how much water is lost, because osmosis drives water reabsorption. So I'm not going to get into the numbers, and I'm not really that worried about the numbers. When we look at the osmolality of body fluids, the normal osmolality is about 300 milliosmoles. Now, The countercurrent really is when fluid flows in opposite directions in the same tube. So really the loop of Henle is what we're really worried about. And I'm not going to get too much into it, except that more in these juxtaglomerular nephrons, the loops of Henle go all the way down into the medulla. And by having lots of sodium-potassium pumps here on the ascending limb, we make the medulla very salty. By making the medulla very salty, we create a lot of osmosis, which then sucks more water out of the descending limb than would normally be able to be removed in normal tissue at 300 milliosmoles. In the depth of the medulla, it's 1200. So a lot more osmosis, which means a lot more water reabsorption. But as the water gets reabsorbed, that means the concentration of sodium in the filtrate goes way up because you're taking away water, not sodium. So that means the concentration of sodium is very high in the ascending limb, where we have sodium-potassium pumps. So it very efficiently pumps the sodium out into the medulla, which then creates the situation of the water that's in the filtrate that's in the descending limb that's following behind is in a high osmotic place, and we reabsorb more water, and we keep this whole thing going. And this is called the countercurrent, because the descending limb is freely permeable to water, and it's hyperosmotic in the interstitial fluid. Lots of water is reabsorbed. The ascending limb isn't permeable to water, and sodium moves easily. So this just follows that. Please do not memorize the numbers. Now, urea is used to, in a large extent, to keep this thing going, because the urea is secreted into the filtrate in the thin segment and reabsorbed by the collecting ducts, which are also in the medulla. So it really just adds, and that's all that we need to know. It just adds to the osmotic gradients in the medulla. Now, the Vasa recta, which are the peritubular capillaries, the straight ones of the loop of Henle in the juxtaglomerular nephrons, they maintain it by not reabsorbing a lot of the sodium, but reabsorbing a lot of the water. So what ends up happening in the Vasa recta is that it maintains this whole heavily osmotic gradient. And that's all we really need out of this. Now, let's go back to this one for a second. As the blood enters here, water leaves the blood, sodium goes in, then sodium gets pumped out, and there's a little bit of water comes back in. Right. So this is the blood, not the filtrate. And you'll see that the venous blood leaving is about the same osmolality as the blood entering. Now, when we go back to the tubules in the loop of Henle, by taking the sodium out in the ascending limb, now what's left is fairly dilute filtrate. And then that's what enters the distal convoluted tubule. When we don't need any more water, we don't use antidiuretic hormone. The aquaporin 2s in the distal convoluted tubule and the collecting ducts don't open, and we end up having dilute urine. So that it ends up being this. Water leaves, sodium leaves, and we're back down to really dilute urine. Nothing gets reabsorbed, and we make a lot of clear pee. To make concentrated urine, the antidiuretic hormone triggers the reabsorption of water by opening the aquaporin 2s. Right? A lot of water gets reabsorbed. So when we look at it this way, the same thing through the loop of Henle. It gets more and more concentrated as we take water out, then becomes less and less concentrated as we take sodium, as we take salt out. It's very dilute here, and then we reabsorb the water, and as the collecting duct passes down through the medulla, through the area of high concentration, more and more water is leaving until we can concentrate the urine to be the same as the medulla by having these aquaporins open. And we can have an osmolarity of 1200 in the urine. Very concentrated urine. And so this is how diuretics work. This is drugs that lower blood pressure or make you pee a lot. You can inhibit ADH using alcohol or something like that. You can give substances that are not reabsorbed, so it stays in the filtrate and make you pee more. This is what happens in the case of diabetics, because the transport maximum of glucose is reached. There's glucose in the filtrate in the loop of Henle, and so therefore it screws up the osmolarity difference and makes for less reabsorption. Caffeine will do it. Other things and other drugs will do it. Okay. And I'm not going to get into this or this terribly. So maybe I will. Proximal convoluted tubule. This is where 65% of the sodium, all the glucose, all the amino acids, right? Lots of the water, most of the ions, all end up being reabsorbed. In the descending loop of Henle, it's water gets reabsorbed. In the ascending loop of Henle, it is sodium and potassium primarily. In the distal convoluted tubule, it is sodium with aldosterone regulation, calcium with parathyroid hormone regulation, And then in the collecting duct is water with ADH regulation. More aldosterone, more for sodium, etc. Okay, the last concept of this section is the idea of renal clearance. And really, this is how much of a substance gets taken out of the blood. How much of the... So, but rather than talk about how much of the substance is taken out of the blood, we can also talk about the amount of blood that is cleared of that substance in a given minute. Now, this is useful to really determine things like the glomerular filtration rate, the kidney function. We use it to look at kidney diseases. We watch how long it takes for a given amount of substance to leave the blood. So when we talk about renal clearance, it's the concentration of the stuff in the urine times the flow rate of the urine over the concentration of the same substance in the plasma. Now, you'll never have to use this formula, but this is how they come up with it. You'll read a lot about renal clearance, but you won't actually be calculating it. So, but really, what's renal clearance? If any substance is completely reabsorbed, the renal clearance will be 0. So normal, healthy people, the renal clearance is 0 for something like glucose. All of it gets filtered out. Everything in the filtrate gets reabsorbed. None of the blood is cleared of glucose. Renal clearance is completely reabsorbed. Anything between 0 and the GFR, some of the substance is reabsorbed. So if the renal clearance is 125 mils per minute, none of it is reabsorbed if the GFR is 125. If the renal clearance is 100, then 25 mils a minute is cleared, or and the rest is reabsorbed. If the renal clearance is actually over the GFR, that means that there is secretion going on. The big trick to remember is that the lower the renal clearance, the more reabsorption. Renal clearance of 0, complete reabsorption. Renal clearance at the same as the GFR, no reabsorption. Renal clearance higher than the GFR, secretion.